The bell rang, a loud, clanging sound that meant the school day was over. For most people, it was a signal to pack up and leave. For her, it was a signal to begin. Her name was Alara, and she moved through the now empty hallways of the Kensington Academy of Arts with a soft, practiced quiet. She was a woman who seemed made of stillness. Her hair, a simple brown, was always tied back. Her clothes were plain and practical, meant for work, not for show. She pushed a large cart filled with bottles and brushes and cloths. To the students who rushed past her in the final minutes of class, she was just part of the building, a piece of the quiet that came after the storm of their noise. For 3 years, this had been her world. The smell of lemon-scented cleaner, the swish of a mop in a bucket, the dust dancing in the beams of the late afternoon sun. It was a simple, rhythmic life. She liked the rhythm. It asked no difficult questions and held no sharp surprises. Her only small rebellion came at 1:15 p.m., right in the middle of her day. That was when the advanced piano class met in the main auditorium. For 25 minutes, she would finish her work in the West Wing a few minutes early. She would slip into the very back row of the vast, dark hall. She would sit, her hands folded in her lap, and she would listen. The sounds that came from the grand piano on stage were complex and powerful. They were pieces by composers with long, important names. Sometimes the music was a furious storm of notes. Other times it was a slow, aching sadness that seemed to hang in the air. The students playing were talented, no doubt. But to Alara's ear, something was often missing. A feeling. A connection. They played the notes, but they didn't always tell the story. As she listened, her fingers, resting on her knees, would move. They would trace invisible patterns. A slow scale here, a tricky chord changed there. It was a silent, ghostly practice. No one ever saw it. No one was ever looking. One Thursday, the piece was particularly troubled. A student was struggling with a fast section, his fingers tripping over each other. The teacher, a man everyone called Maestro Laurent, let out a long, frustrated sigh. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a voice that could carry to the back of a concert hall. "Stop, stop, stop," he said, not unkindly. "You are hitting the notes, but you are missing the heart. This piece is not a race. It is a conversation." The maestro turned to explain something to the class, waving his hands in the air to show the shape of the music. As he did, his gaze swept over the dark auditorium and landed on the single still figure in the last row. Alara, caught in the act of listening, froze. Maestro Laurent smiled. He often saw this janitor quietly going about her work. She was always polite, always faintly smiling. He thought he understood her presence here. It was the simple awe of someone who admired something they could never have. "We have an audience," he announced to the class. A few students turned and giggled. Alara felt her face grow warm. She made a small move to stand, to leave, but the maestro's voice stopped her. "No, no, please stay. It is good for my students to remember that music is for everyone." He walked down the stage steps and began to move up the center aisle towards her. Alara's heart began a slow, heavy thump in her chest. "Tell me, do you enjoy the music?" Alara nodded, her voice a dry leaf in her throat. "Yes, sir? It's very nice, nice." He chuckled. "A humble review. Come down here." This was not a request. It was a gentle command, the kind used on shy children or nervous pets. To refuse would cause more attention, more fuss. All she wanted was to disappear. So, hoping to comply and then escape, she stood and walked slowly down the aisle. Her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the carpet, the students watched with mild, bored curiosity. A break in their tedious practice, Maestro Laurent led her onto the stage. The lights were bright and hot. The grand piano, A vast, glossy black beast seemed to loom over her. She hadn't been this close to an instrument of such quality in 10 years. The smell of it, the old wood, the felt of the hammers, the faint metallic scent of the strings hit her like a physical wave. Memories, dangerous and sweet, rose up in a sudden flood. She pushed them down. "This," Maestro Lawrence said to his class, placing a hand on the piano's lid, "is an instrument of great possibility. But it can also feel intimidating." He turned to Alara, his expression kindly. "There is nothing to fear. The piano does not judge. It only answers." He opened a book of sheet music on the stand. The page was a forest of black notes, complex and dense. It was Schubert. She knew it instantly. The impromptu No. 2 in E-flat major. A piece that sounded like sunlight dancing on water, but required fingers that could move like the wind. "This looks difficult, yes?" he said. She nodded again. "All great things begin with a simple touch. Here." He pulled out the piano bench. "Sit. Just place your hands on the keys. Feel their weight." Every instinct in her screamed to run. But the eyes of the class were on her. The teacher's benign smile waited. To cause a scene would be to stand out, to be remembered. And being remembered was the one thing she could not allow. She sat. The bench was firm. She lowered her hands towards the familiar ivory keys. For a terrifying second, she almost forgot to act. Her body remembered its old, perfect posture. Her wrists remembered how to hover. She caught herself just in time, letting her shoulders slump a little, making her hands look clumsy and unsure. "Good," the maestro said. "Now, just try the first line. The very beginning. Don't worry about the speed. Don't worry about mistakes. We are all friends here." He meant to be encouraging. He thought he was giving a gift, a moment of contact with a beautiful world for someone who lived outside of it. He had no idea. He was asking her to tear open an old wound. Alara took a shaky breath. She looked at the music, not because she needed to, but for show. Then she began. She pressed the first chord, but made her fingers deliberately slack, so the notes sounded muted, uneven. She moved to the next passage, a flowing run of notes. She played them, but she inserted a tiny, artificial hesitation in the middle. She hit a wrong note on purpose, a flat, ugly sound against the harmony. A few students in the front row smirked, covering their mouths. The sound of their stifled laughter was worse than any criticism. But Alara continued. She played the opening bars of the beautiful piece, rendering them slow, plodding, and simple. She turned Schubert's sunlight into a dim, cloudy day. When she finished the line, she let her hands drop quickly into her lap, as if burnt. Maestro Laurent clapped his hands together once. "There, you see? You have touched the music. It is not so scary." He was genuinely pleased with his little experiment. He turned to his class. "A reminder to all of you. Start simple. Feel the music. It is not just in the fingers. It is in the heart of the player, no matter how simple." He patted her shoulder. The touch was meant to be congratulatory. To Alara, it felt like a brand. A noble effort. "Thank you for being a brave example for us today." Alara stood up, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. She walked off the stage, down the aisle, and out the auditorium doors without looking back. The moment she was in the cool, bright emptiness of the hallway, she leaned against the wall. She closed her eyes and took a long, slow breath, waiting for the tremor in her hands to stop. Inside, a storm raged. The feel of those perfect keys under her fingers had been a shock. The wrong notes she had played screamed in her ears. But underneath the shame of the performance was a deeper, more painful ache, the ghost of the music as it should have sounded, as she could have played it, rising up like a beautiful, haunting whisper. She pushed herself away from the wall and went back to her cart. She picked up a cloth and began to wipe down the lockers, the motion automatic and steady. She focused on the smear she was cleaning away, on the shine she was revealing. She told herself it was over. A strange, uncomfortable moment. It would be forgotten by tomorrow. She was just the janitor, a simple woman who had tried and failed to play something difficult. That was the story. She needed it to be the story. But as she worked, the melody of the Schubert played on perfectly, flawlessly, in the silent concert hall of her memory. And she knew, with a sinking feeling, that the quiet rhythm of her life had just been disrupted. The story of the janitor's piano attempt did not disappear. Instead, it took on a gentle, curious life of its own in the halls of the Arts Academy. It became a small piece of folklore. For the students, it was a funny break from routine. For the teachers, it became something else, a sweet, living lesson. The person it meant the least to was Alara herself. She hoped desperately that the strange moment on stage would be forgotten. She went back to her rhythms, her cleaning, her silent listening from the back row. But she felt a new attention on her. Smiles from students were a little wider, a little more knowing. Their hellos held a hint of a shared secret she never agreed to. About a week later, she was wiping down the glass of the music room doors. Inside, a young teacher was leading a junior class. This teacher was newer to the school, full of an energetic kindness that sometimes missed the mark. Her name was Miss Adams, and she believed passionately that art was a flame that could spark anywhere. Miss Adams saw Alara through the glass. Her eyes lit up. She opened the door, the sound of a stumbling Mozart sonata spilling out into the hall. "You're our famous volunteer," Miss Adams said, her voice bright. "The one who braved the Schubert." Alara gripped her cleaning cloth. "Oh no, it was just..." The maestro asked. "And you did it." "That's the spirit." Miss Adams leaned against the doorframe. "My lot are struggling with the concept of emotion. They play like robots." "You know what I mean?" Alara simply nodded, hoping the conversation would end. "Would you? Would you do it again?" Miss Adams asked, her face eager. "For my class? Not Schubert. Something different. I think it would be so good for them to see that passion isn't about perfection. It's about trying." It was the worst kind of trap. It was built on genuine goodwill. Saying no would seem churlish, would make her seem ungrateful for their misplaced encouragement. It would create a problem, a talking point. Silence and compliance were the walls of her hiding place. "I'm not very good," Alara murmured, her old, practiced line. "That's the whole point." Miss Adams beamed. "Tomorrow, during your break, please?" And so, the compulsion became a pattern. What started as a one-time awkward moment turned into a scheduled event. Miss Adams would seek her out. She would have a new piece of sheet music ready, something she thought was inspiring but approachable. She never asked if Alara could read music. She just assumed she couldn't, which made the whole performance seem even more brave. Alara's lunch breaks were no longer her own. The quiet listening ended. Now she was summoned. She would sit at the piano in the smaller practice room, with a dozen young faces watching her. Miss Adams would stand beside her, pointing at the notes on the page as if they were mysterious symbols. "This one here, that's a chord. Just press a few keys together. Don't worry which ones. Let's see what happens." Alara would look at the music. It was Chopin's Prelude in E minor, a piece of profound rainy day sorrow. Every note was a tear. Her heart ached to play it truly, to let that sadness flow out through her fingers. It was a feeling she knew intimately. Instead, she placed her hands stiffly. She played the famous opening chord progression, but she made her fingers land a fraction late, killing the rhythm. She added a pressure on the wrong note, creating a small dissonance. The beautiful weeping melody line she played with a flat, emotionless tone, like someone reading a grocery list. Interesting. Miss Adams would chirp. Hear how she's finding her own way? That's personal expression. The students would nod, some confused, some amused. They saw a kind woman humoring their teacher. They did not see the internal earthquake. For Elara, each performance was a tightrope walk over a canyon of memory. The touch of the keys was a direct line to her past. The smell of the room, the feel of the bench, the weight of the pedal under her foot, it all brought back a flood of sensations. The roar of applause, the heat of stage lights, the proud smile of her father, and always, the laughing presence of her sister beside her on the bench for 4-hand pieces. The memories were so vivid, they were physical. A pain would start behind her eyes. Her throat would tighten. She had to force all of that down, lock it away, and focus only on the careful, deliberate act of failure. It was exhausting. It was a kind of soul-splitting. One part of her, the deepest part, was screaming to play, to finally release the music trapped inside for so long. The other part, the survival part, knew she had to fumble, to be simple, to stay hidden. The worst part was the teacher's feedback. After each clumsy performance, they would offer advice. Maybe try it a little slower next time, Miss Adams would say about a fast Beethoven piece, not realizing Elara was playing it deliberately slow to mask her true timing. Maestro Laurent, hearing of these lessons, once stopped by. He watched her pretend to struggle through a section of a Mozart sonata. He nodded thoughtfully. Your hand shape is a little tense, my dear. Try to relax. Let the music come from your shoulders, not your fingers. He demonstrated a flowing motion with his own elegant hands. Elara would nod, whispering, thank you. Inside, a wild, bitter thought would sometimes rise. Asterisk, you are teaching a bird to fly by clipping its wings. Asterisk, but she would quickly swallow it. Down dot she began to hate the piano in the practice room. The sight of it, once a symbol of joy, now filled her with a heavy dread. It was no longer an instrument. It was an altar where she was forced to sacrifice a piece of her past for the amusement and education of others. The teacher's kindness was the cage. Their smiles were the lock. One afternoon, Miss Adams was particularly excited. Today's something special. A real challenge. I want you to try just a few bars of this. It's from Beethoven's Pathetic A Sonata. It's very dramatic. Don't be scared. The music was placed before her. It was a powerful, stormy passage, full of crashing chords and dramatic silences. To play it badly was harder than to play it well. She had to calculate each mistake. She began. She hammered the chords, but made them sound clumsy and harsh instead of powerful. She rushed the quiet parts, missing the tension. It was a cartoon of the great music. A student in the front row, a boy with sharp eyes who was the best pianist in the class, frowned. He didn't smirk like the others. He just watched, his head tilted. He watched her hands, not her face. When she finished, the usual polite patter of applause came. Miss Adams launched into her lesson about courage. But the boy kept staring. As Elara quickly got up to leave, their eyes met for a second. In his, she didn't see mockery. She saw a flicker of pure confusion. It was like he had heard a familiar word pronounced in a strange, impossible way. That look stayed with her. It was more unsettling than laughter. It was the first crack in her performance, the first hint that her careful act of being simple might not be as convincing as she thought. She returned to her cart, her mind racing. The weight of the compulsion felt heavier that day. It wasn't just about hiding anymore. It was about being forced to dishonor the very thing she had once loved most in the world. Each wrong note she played on purpose felt like a betrayal of the music, of her sister's memory, of herself. She looked down at her hands. They were good hands for cleaning, strong, capable, with short, neat nails. But in her mind's eye, she saw them as they used to be, flying across the keys, powerful and graceful. A deep, lonely sorrow washed over her, more intense than any she had felt in years. The teachers thought they were pulling her up, inviting her into the light. They had no idea they were pushing a ghost deeper into the shadows and asking it to dance for them. The air in the Kensington Academy crackled with a different kind of energy. The annual autumn gala was approaching. This was the school's biggest event, where wealthy donors and proud parents filled the auditorium to see the best student talent. The highlight was always a senior performing a full concerto with the school's student orchestra. This year, the honor had gone to a young man in the final year. He was technically brilliant. His fingers were fast and accurate, a machine of perfect notes. He had chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece that was both a mountain to climb and an ocean of emotion. He was mastering the mountain part just fine. The ocean, however, was giving him trouble. Rehearsals in the main hall became daily affairs. From her various hiding spots, high in the lighting booth, behind the heavy velvet curtains, Elara listened. She heard the soaring melodies, the powerful chords, and she heard the young man play them with a cold, polished precision that left her feeling empty. The music should ache. It should yearn. His playing was flawless, and it was dead. The pressure on him was immense. Teachers hovered. Maestro Laurent's voice grew sharper. It is not a math problem. Where is the heart? Where is the story? The student would nod, play again, and the notes would be the same perfect and lifeless. The afternoon of the final dress rehearsal was a disaster. The student was tight with nerves. In the difficult third movement, in a passage of tremendous passion and technical demand, he fell apart. His fingers fumbled, the rhythm stuttered, and the orchestra ground to a confused halt. Silence fell, heavy and awful. The student slammed his hands on the keys in frustration, a jarring, ugly sound. Maestro Laurent rubbed his temples. The other teachers looked at each other, worried. The concert was in 2 days. It was in this thick cloud of panic that the maestro's gaze swept the auditorium, as if looking for an answer. And it found, up in the balcony, a figure pushing a vacuum cleaner slowly along the carpeted walkway. A desperate, half-formed idea entered his mind. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to break the tension, to remind everyone, especially the frustrated soloist, that this was just music, that it could be approached without this terrible fear. Elara. His voice echoed in the quiet hall. Everyone turned. Elara stopped, the vacuum's motor droning in her hands. She looked down, her heart sinking. "Come down here, please," the maestro called, forcing a lightness into his voice. "We need a change of perspective." This was different from the practice room. This was the full auditorium, the full orchestra, all the senior teachers. The compulsion felt larger, more public, more inescapable. She turned off the vacuum. The sudden silence was deafening. She walked slowly down the curved balcony stairs, every eye following her. The student soloist watched from the stage, his face pale with humiliation and confusion. "We are taking ourselves too seriously," the maestro announced to the room. "Music is joy. It is play, even in its difficult forms." He turned to Elara as she reached the stage floor. "You have been our brave explorer, yes, facing down these musical giants without fear." He gestured to the grand piano. The student soloist reluctantly stood up from the bench, stepping aside with a look of disbelief. "Show us," the maestro said, his tone encouraging, but edged with the stress of the day. "Show us how not to play it. Play the cadenza from this last movement." make a glorious mess of it, remind us all that it is okay to fail, that we can laugh and then begin again. It was the worst thing he could have asked. It was one thing to butcher a simple piece in a small room. It was another to mock this specific, deeply emotional music in front of its struggling, genuine performer, and to ask her to fail on purpose as a joke. She stood frozen. The orchestra members, teenagers, watched with a mix of pity and curiosity. The teachers waited, hoping for the tension to break. The spotlight was hot on her face. She looked at the piano. It was no longer just an instrument. It felt like an enemy, a trap set by her own past. But then she looked at the young soloist. She saw the anger in his eyes, the wounded pride, and something in her shifted. A quiet rebellion stirred. She would not make a mockery of this music. Not for them. Not even to hide. She would not play it perfectly. She couldn't risk that. But she would not insult it either. She sat down. The bench was still warm. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, closing her eyes. She wasn't thinking of the teachers or the orchestra. She was thinking of the music itself, of Rachmaninoff's own deep melancholy. She understood that. She lived in that country dot. When she opened her eyes, her posture had changed. It was subtle, but the student soloist saw it first. Her back straightened, not stiffly, but with a natural, poised curve. Her shoulders, usually hunched in meekness, relaxed and settled. She lifted her hands, and they no longer hovered like uncertain birds. They moved with a quiet, definite authority to the keys. She began. She did not play the notes with technical brilliance. She did not play them fast. She played them slowly. But she played every single note of the complex cadenza. This was not the clumsy, wrong-note failure they expected. This was different. This was raw feeling. Her touch was heavy and suddenly soft as a whisper. She lingered on the aching, dissonant chords, letting the pain in them hang in the air. She rushed through the technical runs, not with clean precision, but with a wild, almost desperate energy. It was messy. It was imperfect. There were small stumbles, a note missed here and there, but every single stumble sounded intentional, like a sob breaking through a song. This was not a perfect performance. It was a true one. It was someone pouring a heartache they knew deeply into the skeleton of the music. The beautiful, yearning soul of the Rachmaninoff, which had been missing all week, suddenly flooded the hall. The orchestra sat utterly still. The teacher's encouraging smiles had melted away, replaced by stunned confusion. Maestro Lawrence's eyes widened. He was a musician first. He heard it. This was not the playing of a simple woman making a brave attempt. This was the phrasing of someone who understood, deeply. Alara lost herself for a minute. The wall she had built between her and the music crumbled under the weight of the emotion. She was not playing for them. She was playing for all the locked-away years, for the sister whose memory lived in every beautiful, sad piece ever written. The music swelled from the piano, not flawless, but alive, breathing, hurting Dot as the final, powerful chords approached. She seemed to remember where she was. The reality crashed back in. She finished the cadenza, not with a triumphant bang, but with a fading, sorrowful resolution that left the air vibrating. Silence. It was a complete, profound silence. No one coughed. No one shuffled. The student soloist was staring at her, his anger gone, replaced by a look of awe. He had just heard the soul of his piece for the first time. The spell was broken by a small sound. It was Miss Adams, who had been standing in the wings. Her voice was a confused, breathless whisper that carried in the quiet. "How did you—" 2 words. They hit Ilara like a physical blow. She looked at her hands on the keys, as if seeing them for the first time. She saw the teachers' faces, no longer kind or patronizing, but filled with dawning, bewildered suspicion. The mask had slipped. Not all the way off, but enough. She had shown too much. Panic, pure and cold, shot through her. Without a word, without looking at anyone, she stood up so quickly the bench scraped back with a loud screech. She turned and walked, then almost ran off the stage. She pushed through the heavy door at the side and disappeared into the dark hallway beyond. Back in the auditorium, the silence held for another long moment. Then, the young soloist walked slowly back to the piano. He sat down. He looked at his own hands. He didn't play a note. He just sat there, thinking. Maestro Lawrence slowly walked to the center of the stage. He looked at the door through which Alara had fled. He looked back at the piano, as if it had just spoken a secret. "Maestro?" Miss Adams said, her voice still small. "What was that?" He didn't answer for a long time. He was replaying the last 3 minutes in his head, the posture, the touch, the heartbreaking phrasing. The truth was whispering to him, but it was a truth so absurd he couldn't yet believe it. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice low and serious. But that was not a mistake. The rehearsal ended in a quiet, confused murmur. The magic of the moment was gone, replaced by a buzzing hive of questions. The teachers gathered in the wings, speaking in hushed, urging tones. "She's had lessons," Miss Adams insisted, her earlier excitement now tinged with defensiveness. "She must have. As a child, perhaps." Maestro Lawrence shook his head slowly. He was staring at the empty piano bench. That was not childhood lessons. That was interpretation. That was pain. You cannot teach that. It is lived. The student who had been watching Alara most closely, the sharp-eyed boy from the practice room, approached them tentatively. "Sir, I noticed something. Her hands. When she plays, when she pretends to play badly, her left wrist. It does this thing." He made a small, fluid, rotating motion. "It's a technique. For legato. For making notes flow together. You taught it to us last month. She does it every time, even when she's hitting wrong notes." The statement landed like a stone in still water. A deliberate mistake was one thing. A subconscious reveal of advanced training was another. It changed everything. Meanwhile, Alara was in the custodial closet. It was a small, windowless room filled with the smells of soap and metal. She sat on an upturned bucket, her head in her hands. The tremor was back, but it was deep inside her now. She had broken her own most important rule. She had let the guard down. She had fed the ghost, and now it was out, haunting the halls. She knew the curiosity wouldn't just fade. Not this time. She thought about leaving, just walking out and never coming back. But the thought was overwhelming. This job, this quiet, invisible life, was the only ground she had left to stand on. Out in the school, the curiosity turned into a search. The story was too strange, too compelling. The sharp-eyed student, his mind buzzing, went home that evening and opened his laptop. He thought about what he'd seen. The woman's face, her posture, the strange mix of fear and power. He tried to think of famous pianists who had vanished. It seemed like a plot from a movie, but still, he searched. He used vague terms. Female pianist disappeared. Child prodigy lost. The results were gossip and old news. Then, on a whim, he described her in the search. Brown hair, quiet early 40s, pianist? Nothing. Frustrated, he sat back. His eyes fell on a stack of school papers. The top one had a photo of the cleaning staff from a newsletter last year, a group shot for a behind-the-scenes article. There she was, standing at the very edge, looking down as if hoping to be cropped out. He saved the image. On a wild impulse, he uploaded the cropped photo of her face to a reverse image search website. He didn't expect anything. It was a grainy, poorly lit school photo. The search spun for a moment. Then a result appeared. A single old result from a European Music Archive website. The photo was black and white, of two young girls, twins, sitting side by side at a grand piano, laughing. They were maybe 12 years old. The caption read, "The Varova sisters, Elena and Anya, following their acclaimed debut at the Salle de Musique." The girl on the left, her eyes, the shape of her face. It was older, softer now, but undeniably her. The student's breath caught in his throat. He clicked the link, his heart hammering. The article was in French, but his browser translated it. It told of the brilliant Varova twins, prodigies from a small town who took the concert scene by storm. It detailed their harmony, their uncanny connection. It ended with a tragic, final line. The duo was tragically silenced after the death of Anya Varova in an automobile accident 10 years ago. Elena Varova subsequently retired from public performance. Elena Varova, Elara Vance. He stared at the screen, his mind reeling. The quiet janitor. The woman they asked to play simple tunes. She wasn't a former hobbyist. She was Elena Varova, a name that would have been known to every serious music student in the world a decade ago. He didn't know what to do. He felt a strange sense of guilt, like he had ripped open a private letter. But the truth felt too big to hold alone. The next morning, before classes, he went to Maestro Laurent's office. He didn't speak. He just placed a printed copy of the article, and the two photos on the desk dot. The maestro picked it up. He read it. His face went pale, then flushed with a deep, mortified red. He read it again, his eyes darting between the laughing girl in the photo and the name on the school's staff roster. The pieces crashed together. The technical hint, the profound emotion, the fear, the hiding. It wasn't shyness. It was trauma. "My God," he whispered, the words full of horror. "What have we done?" He immediately called Miss Adams and another senior teacher into his office. He showed them. Miss Adams's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, not of joy, but of sudden, awful understanding. We made her perform her own. She couldn't finish the sentence. They hadn't been encouraging a novice. They had been forcing a wounded artist to parody her own grief for classroom demonstrations. The weight of their well-meaning condescension collapsed onto them. Every simple try, every good effort, every piece of basic advice offered to her now felt like a slap. They had treated a masterpiece like a child's doodle. They had to find her. They had to speak to her. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about apology, about trying to understand the profound wrong they had unknowingly committed. They found her at the end of the day, in the custodial closet, refilling a mop bucket. She looked up as the three of them filled the doorway. Her face, usually so carefully blank, showed a flicker of the fear they now understood. She saw the printout in Maestro Laurent's hand. Her shoulders slumped. The game was over. "May we come in?" Maestro Laurent asked, his voice uncharacteristically soft. She nodded, stepping back into the small space. The closet felt even smaller with them there. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the drip of water from a tap. Miss Adams spoke first, her voice trembling. We know. We know who you are, Elena." The name, spoken aloud after so long, was a physical shock. Elara flinched. Maestro Laurent held out the printed article. "Why?" he asked, and the word was loaded with 100 questions. Asterisk, why are you here? Why did you hide? Why did you let us do that to you? Asterisk. Elara looked at the photo of her and her sister. A lifetime ago. The joy in that picture was almost too bright to look at. She leaned against a shelf of cleaning supplies, her energy gone. "You think you compelled a simple woman to play difficult pieces," she said, her voice low and tired. It was the most any of them had ever heard her say at once. "You didn't. You compelled a ghost to haunt her own life." She took a slow breath, her eyes on the photo. The piano, it was never just mine. It was ours. It was our language. We spoke it together. When she was gone, the language, it died. The person who played it died too. To play it alone, to play it properly. It was like speaking to an empty room where her echo should have been. It was unbearable. She looked at the teachers, her eyes clear and full of a deep old sadness. Here, I could be near the music. I could listen. And when you asked me to play, the mistakes were mine, just mine. The silence between the wrong notes was mine. It was quiet. It didn't scream her absence the way the perfect music would. It was a different kind of pain. One I could manage. Miss Adams was crying openly now. We thought we were being kind. We thought we were sharing the joy. "You were sharing a coffin," Ilara said quietly, but without anger. There was no malice in her, only a bone-deep exhaustion. "And asking me to sit inside it for your lessons. Every time you said, 'Try it slower,' or 'Don't worry about mistakes,' you were nailing the lid shut. You didn't know. But that's what it was." Maestro Laurent felt a shame so deep it was hollow. He, a man of music, had completely failed to hear the real silence in her performance. He had only heard the false notes, not the true sorrow behind them. "The gala is tomorrow," he said, his voice thick. "You must play, properly. It is your right. It is your return?" A faint, sad smile touched Ilara's lips for the first time. It wasn't a happy smile. "No," she said softly. "That is not what this is. This was never about a return. There is no returning." She looked at the three stunned faces, the teachers who now saw the ghost they had been patting on the head for months. "You wanted to know how I played that cadenza?" she said, turning back to her bucket. "I didn't play it for you. I didn't even play it for me. I played it for her. And that," she said, picking up a cloth, "is a private conversation." The night before the gala, the school buzzed with a different kind of secret. The story of the janitor had transformed. It was no longer a cute anecdote. It was a quiet, trembling legend. Whispers traveled from student to student, teacher to teacher. They spoke the name Elena Varova with a kind of awe. The weight of what had been happening in their practice rooms settled over the academy, heavy and humbling. On the evening of the gala, the grand auditorium glittered. Men in suits and women in fine dresses filled the plush red seats. The air smelled of perfume and anticipation. Backstage was a chaos of nervous energy. The student orchestra tuned their instruments. The chosen soloist, the young man who was to play the Rachmaninoff, stood in a corner, looking pale. His hands were shaking. He wasn't thinking about the difficult notes anymore. He was thinking about the sound that had come from the piano 2 days before. The raw, true feeling in that imperfect cadenza. His own perfect performance now felt like an empty shell. The pressure wasn't about technique now. It was about soul. And he felt utterly hollow. He looked at his shaking hands, then at the packed hall through the curtain's crack. A cold panic, deeper than any stage fright, seized him. He couldn't do it. Not like this. To go out and play it perfectly dead after hearing it played so alive. It would be a lie. He felt sick. He found Maestro Laurent, who was adjusting his bow tie with nervous fingers. "Sir," the student said, his voice thin. "I can't." The maestro turned, expecting normal pre-show nerves. But the look on the young man's face was pure terror. "It's just nerves. Breathe." "No," the student insisted, shaking his head. "You don't understand. I heard her. After that, I can't just play the notes. I don't know how to play them the other way. Not yet. If I go out there now, I will ruin it. I'll ruin the music." The truth of it hit the maestro. The boy wasn't being dramatic. He had been shown a depth he couldn't reach, and it had paralyzed him. The clock was ticking. The program was about to begin. In the quiet of the custodial office, Alara sat in her street clothes, ready to leave. Her part in this was over. The secret was out. She had said what she needed to say. She just wanted to go home, to her small, silent apartment. But a part of her needed to hear the music one last time, to see the night through. She slipped into the very back of the auditorium, a shadow in the standing room at the rear. She watched the first few performances, a dance piece, a string quartet. The crowd clapped politely. Then it was time for the concerto. The orchestra took their places. The conductor raised his baton. The spotlight moved to the empty piano bench. A murmur went through the crowd. Where was the soloist? Backstage, panic was rising to a fever pitch. The student was sitting on a crate, head between his knees, insisting he couldn't move. Maestro Laurent looked from the terrified boy to the waiting audience. His career, the school's reputation, everything was on the line. In his desperation, a single impossible thought formed. He pushed through the backstage clutter, his eyes searching. He found her, standing in the dark at the back of the hall. He walked quickly down the side aisle, ignoring the curious looks from the patrons in the front rows. He stood before her. He didn't look like a proud maestro anymore. He looked like a man who had lost his way and was only just realizing it. "He can't go on," the maestro said, his voice low and urgent. "He's not ready. Not after hearing you." Alara shook her head, taking a step back. "That's not my problem." "I know," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "I know it isn't. Please hear me. This is not a command. It is not a teacher's request. It is." He struggled for the words, his pride gone. "It is a plea. From one person who loves music to another." He glanced at the anxious crowd, then back at her. "They are waiting for a show, for a perfect performance. But you and I, we know that is not what music is. Not really." He took a deep breath. "You said yesterday that playing for her was a private conversation. I am asking you if there is any part of that conversation left to have it here. No, not for them. Not for the school. Not for me. But for the music itself. And for her." He was not compelling the simple woman anymore. He was begging the ghost to speak. Alara looked past him at the grand piano sitting alone in the bright spotlight. It looked like an island. For 10 years she had been swimming away from it. The thought of walking toward it in front of all these people made her feel dizzy. But his words echoed. Asterisk for the music itself. And for her, asterisk not a comeback. A farewell. A proper one. She didn't make a decision. Her feet simply began to move. She walked past the maestro, down the side aisle. A whisper rippled through the audience as they saw a plainly dressed woman, not the young man in a tuxedo, walking toward the stage. Confusion spread. She stepped up onto the stage. The lights were blinding hot. She could feel the gaze of hundreds of people, but she didn't look at them. She only saw the piano. She walked to it and sat on the bench. The conductor, bewildered, leaned over. "The Rachmaninoff?" he whispered. Alara shook her head. She looked out at the orchestra, a sea of young, uncertain faces. She said one word, clearly and softly into the microphone. "Debussy." The conductor hesitated, then understood. He turned to his musicians, gave a quick, low instruction. They shuffled their sheet music, finding the piece. She placed her hands on the keys. This time there was no act, no pretend clumsiness. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness. She closed her eyes and thought of her sister. Not of the loss, but of the joy. The silly jokes they'd share between rehearsals. The way their elbows would bump when they played together. The sound of her laughter. She began to play Claire de Lune. Not the Rachmaninoff with its storm and passion, but this piece of gentle, moonlit sadness. Her sister's favorite. She did not play it with the blinding technique of a child prodigy. She played it with the hands of a woman who had lived. The notes came slowly, each one allowed to bloom and fade. There was a slight waver in the rhythm here, a note not perfectly clear there. It was not a flawless performance. It was something better. It was human. She poured every memory into the gentle rising chords. The ache of absence was there, but so was the love, the gratitude for the time they had. The music was no longer a scream into a void. It was a lullaby, a thank you, a goodbye. In the audience, people stopped wondering who she was. They just listened. Some closed their eyes. A few had tears on their cheeks, though they didn't know why. They were not hearing a spectacle. They were overhearing a heart. The teachers sat together in the third row. Miss Adams cried silently. Maestro Laurent listened, and for the first time, he truly heard her. He heard the simple, devastating truth she had been trying to tell them all along. This was not about hiding a talent. It was about honoring a love too big to be contained by performance. As the final, shimmering notes faded into silence, the hall was utterly still for a long, long moment. Then, not a roar of applause, but a slow rising wave of sound, respectful, deep, and filled with an emotion no one could quite name. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the piano for a second, then gently closed the lid over the keys. A soft, final click. She stood up, gave a small, brief nod not to the crowd, but to the instrument itself. Then she walked off the stage, back into the shadows of the wings. She did not return for a bow. The performance was complete. Backstage, she passed the young soloist. He was standing straight now, his face streaked with tears. He looked at her, and instead of envy or shame, there was only gratitude. She had shown him what to reach for. She collected her coat from the custodial office and left through a side door. Stepping out into the cool night air, the gala continued, but its heart had already happened. The teachers, the students, they all understood something new. Genius was not just about playing the difficult pieces perfectly. It was about knowing when to play, what to play, and why. And sometimes the most profound performance was not about being seen at all, but about finally being heard. Alara walked home, the sounds of the city in her ears. The ghost was not gone, but it was at peace. The conversation was finished. For the first time in 10 years, the silence inside her did not ache. It was just quiet. And in that quiet, she could finally remember the music and the laughter, just as it was.